Okie doke. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Gaby Primstone, and I help guide change so that organizations can actually adapt and thrive. One lesson I keep coming back to is this: change has its own logic, doesn't follow neat plans. And when we try and force it into start and finish boxes, friction and frustration are pretty much guaranteed. And that's why I'm excited about today's conversation, which we've called Living with Disruption, Holding Change Without an End Date. And we're going to explore a different approach, which is moving from managing change like a project or initiative to holding it as a living, responsive system. And in a world where disruption is business as usual, sorry about the cliche, but the old mindset doesn't just fall short, it can actually get in the way, which is exactly why I have brought together a group of really fantastic change and OD practitioners. We've got Allison Tsao, who brings a sharp diagnostic lens, and she draws on some pretty interesting approaches from quantum physics to living systems in order to help leaders create lasting human change. And Alison, I know the word human is probably the most important word in that whole sentence for you. Sarah Davis, who challenges the assumption that more is always better and helps leaders find what she calls enough. I'm really curious to explore that with you, and thank you for being here. And last but definitely not least, we've got Doug Wolfson. He is the co-founder of the Rethink Change Conference. He has over 25 years hands-on experience guiding transformation in some of Australia's most iconic brands. And as I've said the word Australia, I realized that we all live in Australia, we all live in Sydney, but I'm ex-South African and everyone else here is American. So welcome. And it's great to have all of you here. I'm looking forward to getting stuck into this conversation. Just for those who are listening, here's how we're going to run the discussion. Firstly, we'll explore and discuss why the project mindset is so appealing when it comes to change and what it potentially misses. Next, we'll explore some tensions that change leaders are being asked to hold in today's change landscape. And lastly, we'll end with practical perspective shifts that you can take back into your organization. So, three buckets of questions, and we will see how we go with that. All right, so let's get started. And I'm going to pose a question to you guys on the panel. Please feel free to interject. Let's keep this really informal and very conversational. Let's start with this. Even though disruption is now the norm, it's business as usual, many leaders still treat change like a fixed project, something with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And my question to you is, why do you think this project mindset is so hard to shake? I might start with you, Alison, and let's see where the conversation goes from there. I'm only saying you, Alison, because you are in my line of sight now.
And usually A for
Not
Allison means I'm the first in the alphabet to start.
that too.
Sure. Well, I have a lot of hypotheses about this, Gabby, but the one I will share right now is that from what we know about neuroscience, our brains are wired to certainty,
Yeah,
right? And what we know in the business context is there's so much increasing uncertainty out there that our brains are really craving a sense of security, stability, certainty, both inside of work and also outside of work. Like if we look at our macro climate right now, there's disruption and uncertainty at global scales. So it's not surprising that our organizations mirror a similar pattern.
yeah,
And so, in the face of that uncertainty, what can we control? Well, projects and plans and time frames. And being able to do that for ourselves gives not only ourselves, but the people we lead and the organizations we're part of a sense of stability.
yes, yes, even if it might be an illusion.
Yeah.
But what's interesting in what you're saying, Alison, is that you are referring to some of our deepest human needs and human
Hmm.
desires. And the need for certainty, and I guess linked to that control and the comfort of a clear beginning and an end, it kind of feels safer to put change in that box than it does to accept it as something that's unpredictable and ongoing. So you're tapping into a really core human need. Yeah,
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 100%.
yeah. That's great. Anyone else like to add to that or bring a different perspective around the stickiness of change as a project mindset?
I would. I'd like to express the what society's shown us for so many years about what work is, how it operates. It's incredibly from the industrial perspective, and that becomes mechanistic. A plus B equals C, and
Mm,
that is clear. Like you were saying, Allison, from what we as humans are searching for. So we've been working in the rational brain for so long, and that is satisfying. But as we're all here to discuss today, that's starting to come to a point where
mm.
it's not working anymore.
Yeah. And it kind of, we realize that we have to admit we can't fully predict or control how change unfolds. So I think that's, a very salient observation and something certainly a lot of leaders that I've worked with struggle with. Thanks so much, Sarah. Doug.
So I guess I'll start with it's what we know. It's call it like the status quo. But so for me, there's probably like two areas that I'd say to start with. One is from probably a structural or organizational level. That's how a lot of organizations are set up to run programs, projects, and
Yes.
episodic change. And
Yes.
then the other is it's what we know as leaders or managers. It's either what we're taught or not taught. And so the first thing I'd say, and I think both Allison and Sarah kind of touch upon this, but the organizations are kind of set up for stability, right? They're
Yeah.
set up to reward the overall organization around business as usual delivery. So you get focused on, I would call it stability, efficiency, and kind of predictability. And I think Allison mentioned about, say that the neuroscience of that, but that's how organizations are set up. And so I guess touching upon what you were saying as well, Gaby, is that when an initiative does come along, it's set up from again, whether it's responsive to the outside environment or there's something internal to set up, there is a certain protocol that they follow that you lift up. This is the status quo. You lift up a program or project. The way that the organizations are set up is there's a funding mechanism.
Mm,
There's governance around steering committees and mitigations of risks. So that's where we fall into around I guess, the organizational of where we're starting from with a clear start and finish in kind of programs, I'd
mm,
say. And
mm.
then, so that's kind of the program or the structural kind of setup. But then from a leadership or management is most managers or leaders are not taught in leading change. Some do. There are some programs in a lot of organizations for leadership teams, probably leading change, but most of the frontline managers or middle managers, they don't have that opportunity. In my experience in a lot of organizations is the people that rise to that middle level of management, they've been promoted because of their technical expertise, not necessarily about leadership, and so you have a lot of people that are very good technical managers,
Mm,
but when it comes to leading change, they just haven't learned. They haven't. So the only way they've probably learned is by trial and error of when they've gone through this in the past. And they also know, and the default is they get remunerated or they get their KPIs are based on their day-to-day delivery. So we're kind of
yeah.
stuck where we are between both the
Yes.
organizations and the way that the people that have been tasked with leading change don't necessarily have the knowledge of what could be different.
I think you're raising a really interesting point, and I'd like to just drill down into it because you're talking about, just to go back to the structural piece, you're talking about organizations being set up in a particular way. And it's interesting because a lot of leaders that I work with already know that treating change like a project isn't the answer, but they feel stuck, as you say, between a rock and a hard place because, to what you're saying, the whole system reinforces that mindset from budgets to reporting structures. You've mentioned a few, governance, KPIs, and so forth. It's baked into the way that we measure success. And the conversations I've had with leaders is it feels a little bit like a losing proposition to fight that. So my impromptu question to the panel is, does anyone have any ideas on how we can get around that? Because it's a very real pragmatic challenge. And thank you for bringing that into the conversation, Doug.
I,
Allison.
I love that, Doug. I love you talking about the structures and the systems that surround why people behave the way they do. And while my perspective on this, it's not a simple solution, but I think this is the one that we're grappling with in business, but also in more public institutions as well, is that from a systems perspective, we design systems exactly as, perfectly to create the outcomes that we're trying to create. And so essentially what I'm hearing is we're designing the systems in these organizations to enable stability and predictability,
Yeah,
right? Consciously or unconsciously, that's what we've been doing and that's what we continue to do. And some part of that is serving us, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it anymore. So we really have to inquire as to why do we keep doing that? And is it really helpful at this point or is it not? And what I love you inquiring into, Gabby, is that the friction, how much friction is enough friction for us to say, actually, we need to redesign the system and the structures that
yes,
support it.
yes.
And so I'm keen and curious when I talk to the leaders that I support is like how much friction is there? And oftentimes being a change practitioner, I know that humans often don't change until the pain of staying the same becomes too great,
That's exactly
right?
right. I mean, that's the intelligence of pain in a sense. It helps us really get out of our comfort zone. I want to come back to something you've said around is it serving us or not, in a couple of moments. I've got a slightly um, non-binary thought about this, and I think it's quite important because we've got different people who are going to be listening to this, that the shift in my mind doesn't come by throwing out the system, either overnight or at all. But it happens when we teach leaders how to hold two lenses at once. Yes, you meet the system's need for structure and reporting. It might be a comfort zone, but it does serve a purpose, to your point, Allison. But alongside that, you build the muscle of seeing change as a living process. And what that means is that in the context of these projects and these KPIs and deliverables and reporting and board oversight and all that good stuff, it means as a leader, you've got to pay attention to what's actually happening in the organization, and you've got to use that data to guide your next move. So it's not an either or. It can be a both and, that these two realities, I guess, can live side by side. And for me, as I'm thinking through this, solution doesn't seem to be to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because that's going to elicit just too much anxiety, and we don't want that in it. I think people live with enough anxiety in organizations. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was just
Sarah?
going to speak to, again, what Doug had said earlier about the
Yeah.
structure and the projects and, again, these systems. And what I have found in it is that it's easier for us to go in and go, okay, this plus this equals this, and we know the system, we know how it works. And it actually requires a bit less of us as individuals and as humans to navigate that. Whereas what we're talking about by merging and working between these paradox is that we're demanding more of the individual from an awareness perspective and also a capacity perspective, not in a doing more mindset, but it's actually the depth or the quality of how they show up and navigate the situations they're exposed to.
Yes. And I know, Sarah, that we're going to talk about tensions in a moment, and you're going to touch on this very tension. I know what you're about to talk about, and it really dovetails really nicely into that. So thanks for bringing that in. I might add one more thing before we do move forward, and I think it was you, Allison, that spoke about the project mindset being so sticky because we're wired as humans for certainty and for control. I'd add another human need and a fear that I'm thinking of a couple of clients who I've had this kind of conversation with, where they found it really difficult challenging this change in initiative mindset because there was a fear of losing credibility. So they felt, and this was a big leap, that if they couldn't point to a plan and say, we're here now and next we'll be there, it would feel like they're not doing their job in the eyes of the senior leadership team or the board or whoever they were reporting back to. And so I think the fear of losing credibility might also kind of play into it because it's a lovely, um, I guess, a way of showing progress on a page, and that really does elevate the status of the change leader. So that was just something that kind of came up as you guys were talking for me. Before we move into the tensions, I actually was thinking about one final question related to this topic, because Alison, you were asking the question, is it serving us? We need to ask that question, is it serving us or not? And so the question for those of you who would like to answer it is, what have you noticed, if anything, going wrong when leaders treat change like a project rather than as a living system? What are some of the traps we can fall into? Where doesn't it serve us? Perhaps that's the question. What have you noticed playing out in that regard?
I might just jump in. Well, certainly
Mm,
seeing it as episodic and just as the short term, it's helpful for a short term, but when you look at it in the longer term piece, you're building in some kind of maybe technical kind of debt because you're solving one problem, but you're maybe creating some other
that's the
problems
point. Yeah,
later.
yeah,
Certainly, there could be some of those challenges there. And a big issue with running in projects and programs, if there's not very good alignment, certainly at the leadership level, you end up focusing in little areas. So until you have that mindset around the continuous kind of change and the enterprise, you will still sometimes um, solve today's problem, but create some issues for tomorrow,
that's
potentially.
right.
Yeah.
And that muscle you're talking about, Doug, is really something that needs to cut across any change that comes into the organization. It's something that needs to be transferable no matter what the organization is being hit with, I think. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Thank you for that. I might add, I actually might come in here. I'm kind of flipping between the host and also really wanting to add because I'm so passionate about this. I'll just add something very quickly. One of the things that I've seen when you work with change only as an initiative and you don't hold it as a living kind of responsive process is that people can mistake movement for progress. And when you look at it, you think about it, a project plan creates activity. And even though that might be meaningful, important activity, it doesn't necessarily mean that once you've done it, the organization's actually shifted. So, one of the red flags I've seen is that it could create a false sense of progress. And what I often notice is that the underlying shifts that actually need attention don't get attention because the deliverables are being met, and that's what becomes the primary focus. So, just some food for thought for change managers out there. Just thought I would add that in. Allison?
Yeah, I want to kind of double highlight, underscore both of what you and Doug are saying, because Doug, you hit on a point where, traditional businesses, especially project-oriented businesses, are really focused on short-term profits and results because of the nature of the budgeting cycle, because of stakeholder expectations, because of market perception. And so when we are rewarding organizations for that short-term mindset, we're reinforcing a short-term mindset. And so when confronted with decisions around, am I going to get results in the next quarter versus in the next 2 years, it's no wonder that we're making decisions based on the next quarter because that's what's going to get the result. And also, with leaders moving on so quickly these days, right, career to career, team to team, role to role, they have very little incentive to think about the longer term because they may not even be in the role or the organization then. So I think we have to really think about, our own leadership legacy, but also the short and versus long-term horizon
Yeah.
around how we are making decisions and what the longer term impacts are of that.
I love what you're
Um,
saying, and I'm wondering when Doug talks about the muscle, we define capabilities both in terms of skills and meta skills. The meta skill being the kind of mindset or attitude that person brings to bear. I wonder if there's a meta skill that's needed to be developed in what you're saying that is around stewardship, you
well,
know?
I think the meta skill, Gabby, I love that term, is
I
something
love
you
it.
named
Yeah.
early on when you
Yeah.
launched us into this panel, which is the ability to hold paradox.
Yes. Let's get
It's
into
a
that.
it's a both and short and long term, right?
Yes.
Structured
Yes.
and flexible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And let's get into that. I think it's a lovely natural segue into the second meaty part of the conversation, which is around the tensions that a lot of leaders live in. Because if you think about it, leaders often operate in two worlds. Most of our client leaders are actually really savvy. So they know what an organization needs in the moment versus these ingrained habits or outdated patterns. So I guess the question is, where do you notice the biggest tug of war between old mindsets and what's needed in today's change landscape? So what are some of the paradoxes or tensions that change leaders are being asked to hold? I'll throw it over to whoever's ready to answer that. And it is a meta skill. Holding the paradox is a meta skill. It's a mindset, it's a perspective.
It's a meta skill, Gabby. It's also like a lot of my change work over the past few years has moved more into the coaching space precisely because I'm really passionate about this being the skill. If we are able to hold a both and most of our brains need to reconcile. We
Yeah.
need it to be good or bad, right or wrong, black or white.
Yeah.
Whereas the meta skill we're talking about here is to be able to hold the both
Yeah.
which I'm seeing the need growing in that, and that's shaped how my own, support of change projects has evolved into more of a coaching and vertical development lens. We need to be growing our consciousness. We have to have the capacity to be able to hold the both and. And if
Yeah.
we don't, we will continue to create friction around not being able to think about short and long term,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Not being able to be structured and flexible.
Correct. Not being, and I know one of you is going to talk about not being able to hold the requirements of the day-to-day operations as well as the changing nature of the organization, transformation and BAU. There are a host of these paradoxes. What in your mind, Allison, now that we're just talking to you in your front of screen again, what's the biggest kind of paradox or tension that you are seeing change leaders having to hold in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think it's structure and flexibility.
Yeah, yeah,
When do I lean on structure? Not for structure's sake, not because that's how we've done it and that's how the system supports us, but because it's really serving a purpose here. And then when do I lean into more emergence and flexibility because that's what this project requires.
yeah.
Otherwise, if we don't lean into that, most of the projects and leaders that I support are burning out. They're change fatigued.
It
Right.
really is one of the causes, big causes of change fatigue. I'm just thinking back as you're talking to something Doug said perhaps 15 minutes ago, is how difficult holding that paradox is because so many of us are I wrote the word, you didn't say it, Doug, but are conditioned. I think you said trained, but conditioned to think in terms of predictability and structure and measure, and how challenging it is to unlearn that as a change leader, as you're talking. That's a really great one. Do you have any thoughts on how people can live with that paradox or hold both? Anything practical that people can kind of take away around this conundrum? And Doug, will bring you in. I can see you wanting to chat as well.
Um, Re-anchor me on the question because I did want to make space for Doug. I saw him take
Okay.
himself off mute. Can you
Yes.
just,
Well, the question was, and we can come back to it, but the question was, is there a practical way that you can just help leaders think about how they know when to embrace structure versus how they tune into laying off structure and control and let things become a bit emergent? Any practical question, takeaway, anything that you can give listeners, because we're talking quite conceptually, and I'd like
yeah,
to bring it back into practice.
yeah, yeah. My usual response to that is when you're working on a deliverable, asking yourself, what problem is this deliverable solving?
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, so the classic example is like change impact assessments or stakeholder resistance management plans. And I really, when I see clients spending a lot of time doing those, oftentimes by the time they're finished with that deliverable, the deliverable becomes outdated and then they're doing it
Yes,
again. Right.
exactly.
And so I really want them to tune into what problem is this solving? Is it solving the need for certainty? Then it's probably not useful right
Oh,
now. Right.
great.
Or is it solving something bigger? That's maybe a
Wonderful.
micro
Oh, that's
question people
beautiful.
can start with.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thanks for that. Doug, let's bring you in.
Yeah, sure. So again, just repeating again, like that paradox of kind of the structures and incentives and kind of reporting, that's all kind of built in or baked into kind of the BAU. Whereas we keep hearing that organizations have to be agile and adaptive. And we've heard this now. I mean, I've heard this probably for about 15 years now, like agile, and we still haven't really made the shift. There's been lots of movements around agile methodology, and it's more of still in project space, but I haven't really seen this work in lots of organizations. And many times it's in name only, that some organizations doing better than others. But I would just say, in my experience, and I think Allison, I think you had mentioned it, but the idea of friction. So when the pain is more than the gain at some point, I mean, a lot of these organizations feel this. Like I hear this all the time. It comes up whether it's the fatigue, but leaders, just in general, it's all about keeping the operations kind of steady and but at the same time working in programs and projects. So if I do a lot of work in programs and projects and people are kind of seconded into as business owner involved, so
Yeah.
they're kind of they're in two spaces. And sometimes I have heard, and this is almost a quote, is people saying, I almost have two full-time jobs. So I'm in
Yes.
the morning fighting fires, with trying to, you know, doing some reporting issues, or maybe there's some kind of system issues. And in the afternoon, I'm in program meetings and I'm trying to, get people involved in as SMEs, involved in understanding where they need to get involved with, maybe setting up pilots. But these are people that are time pressed, resource squashed, going in two different places
Yeah.
because they still see it as two different things. They don't see it, and I think that's part of our conversation, is one whole, but they still see it as two different things. And they
Yeah.
say, I'm being judged on this is my day job, and then I have this other program one. And it
Yes.
hasn't switched yet
Yes.
and I think that's kind of what the topic is here, or think about how do you start to think about it as the one. But one of the and we've used the language, the whether you want to call it your meta skill or the idea, but the term, and I haven't seen this done really well in some place, but I've heard certainly the topic of it of ambidexterity, kind of like that business
Mm.
term about being able to focus on kind of the current operations and then look at kind of future opportunities.
Yeah.
So the idea of like how do you and the terms I usually use is exploit, which is kind of looking at the current state. How do I get the most out of my organization? That's about optimizing it. And then explore about preparing for tomorrow. There are some, usually the senior leaders or the executive leaders are quite good at that. Like I have seen in a lot of places, they're very good at kind of being at, that very high level and then zooming in and then zooming out. But very often that middle layer, which is so important, they don't have kind of that, again, if you want to use it, that meta skill set, but they don't have that mindset of that ambidexterity necessarily.
Yeah.
Because they're
Yeah.
usually squashed in the middle. They're trying to report upwards, but then
Yeah.
also manage the tension down below.
That's right.
Yeah.
They are the forgotten linchpin in many ways to effective
important.
org
Yeah.
transformation. And I had a client a couple of weeks ago, we chatting about me going in to run a piece of culture transformation there. And the assumption coming from them was, oh, we'll start at the top with the SLT. I said, no, they're trained to death. Let's actually start at the middle management level and see what emerges from there. It's a really salient point. Sarah, thank you so much. I want to bring your voice in, but before I do that, can I just loop back to something Doug said, which was a throwaway comment, but something I think I can bring a little bit of pragmatism to. Doug, you said that, organizations have been talking adaptable, agile for a decade, if not more. It's become like a cliche, hasn't it? And I was about a decade ago, worked for an organization, and agile was becoming the next big thing, and we had to bring it into the organization. But this goes back to Allison, your point about holding the tension between like a structured approach and then knowing when to adapt and when to really meet the system where it's at. This particular organization was understandably, for good reasons, completely risk averse. And it was pathologically risk averse. So all it could ever tolerate was incremental change. And the minute risk came into the equation, transformation shut down. And so once we worked this out and we understood what we were dealing with, the task didn't become how do we implement agile? It became how do we seed agile? And so what we did was it's not a novel idea, but it just kind of links to this. We set up an agile lab in a part of the business, small, ring-fenced. They had different rules that they could play by. It was, in a nutshell, it was freedom within constraints. And they made such great progress that the idea started to naturally seed throughout the organization. And that's how change happened in an organization of 32,000 people, as opposed to implementing a change initiative. So it just dovetailed to what you were saying, but also, Allison, the tension you were making earlier. You were trying to, bring in around structure versus when do you kind of loosen up and become more adaptive. And it worked. Sarah.
I was just going to share what you just discussed about having that lab of a few individuals within a larger organization. Like that's speaking to Emmett Rogers' law of diffusion, right? Where you get those early adopters, they prove that yes, this has worked before, and then the rest of the team goes, oh, great, it can work, and their fear levels drop. So
Exactly.
they're then capable to walk forward into that, and it sticks more.
It
right?
sticks.
Yeah.
You've got a really interesting tension that I would love to hear, and it's really kind of viscerally tied to the work that you do. Can you share that with the audience, please?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in my observations and workings, I've been exploring the less and more. This is something obviously spoken about in architecture, but it's something in organizations and leadership we see all the time. Right now we're in an age of more, like everything is accessible, everyone has a voice, everyone's selling you something. You can't open your email inbox without having 50 plus, subscriptions or notifications about new events and activities that you can participate in. And so I think organizations they're almost numb now because they don't know which avenue to choose. Again, over inundated. And so they also know that they can't just completely back away. and cut everything off and say, nope, we're not going to exist in this world. We're just going to put our heads down and not pay any attention. It's not realistic. So I guess those are the two paradoxes. But then you come into, okay, what's enough? What's enough for us? And what's enough for me? And I think when folks start to explore that and understand that, at least the leaders in the organizations I'm working with, they name it, right? They're naming it. They're identifying where those boundaries are, when to go into more, when to pare back, when less is actually more useful. But all of that, when you're talking about what is the thing, the tangible, practical thing, and I think that's actually reflection. Not reflection as sit back and do absolutely nothing and just wait for the universe to speak to you, but a reflection of just observing and noticing, instead of the head down, bum up mentality. Yeah.
I think that's so beautiful. I love that idea. I love what you're saying. And I think the way that I've heard the art of reflection being framed is the skill or the art of strategic inaction. It's the same. So it's actually a hugely strategic move that you're describing, which is when leaders or the system kind of steps back to observe and to notice the patterns and to meet the system where it is at. But I imagine, and I'm curious to hear anyone's experience in this, that uh, doing less but doing what matters. I think everyone can agree in principle is such a great thing, but it's hard mastering the art of doing less or even doing nothing or enough, as you put it, when the instinct to human nature is to act or to fix something. So how do you overcome that particular challenge? Does anyone, Sarah, you or anyone else here, have a solution to how you get people into that reflective mode when it's so anxiety provoking? Allison.
I'm going to bang on this drum because
Bang on
maybe,
it.
my adult development background is coming in, but these are all kind of levels of consciousness that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so being able to reflect essentially is learning how to learn, right? If I can learn how to learn, then I have more capacity to be adaptive and resilient and all these and change able, all of these skills, these meta skills we're talking about. Which is why I see a lot of leaders who are leading change, or maybe they're stepping up further in the organization. Organizations are doubling down on investing in their leadership development precisely because they need these meta skills.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I don't think there's a shortcut solution, and I often see that organizations are looking for that shortcut solution, and leadership programs are getting squeezed from 1 week retreats into 2 hour
Yes.
bite-sized,
Yes.
webinars with no real in-person interaction. And actually, I think it's counterintuitive, but we need to be doubling down on developmental opportunities so that we give people a safe space to practice what may feel like very new, very confronting skills like letting go of control, like actually exploring the concept of less is more and what that means, not being able to predict, but rely on intuition instead to
Yes.
guide our judgments. Those are all
Yes.
very different skills that we haven't historically needed to navigate our environment.
And we certainly haven't been taught in any way,
Yeah.
shape, or field. What you're describing is really opening up the practice field so that people can learn experientially as opposed to bite size, because the trend you're describing is bite size learning, micro learning, and it's pragmatic, but you lose a whole lot of richness in that process. Certainly, when you're trying to upskill anyone in the system, not just middle managers, whomever, and really rewire the way of thinking around change, you need to create more time
Yeah,
to
yeah.
think.
And I'm not saying like more time, yes. And I also recognize pragmatically lots of leaders are stretched or pressed for time. And so micro content, micro learning can be a powerful way to meet this
Yeah.
modern context of organizations. But what I see when we do that, we're still falling into the more is more trap. We're trying to
Exactly.
squeeze 1 week into 2 hours rather than think discerningly about 2 hours. How do I break down the micro skill of thinking adaptively, or holding paradox? How do I break that down and drip feed micro bits rather than
Great.
taking a week's worth of content and just trying to deliver it in 2 hours?
Yes. So back to you, Sarah. Say what
Uh,
you want to say. This
I was just
dovetails right into you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Allison, like one of the that more the micro, but they all add up, right? And then that tips people over the edge where they kind of just tune out. And I think I know one of the exercises I've been doing with organizations and leaders is actually an elimination exercise, saying, okay, cool, here's everything you've got going on. What's, as you said earlier, not serving you, or moving you closer to your end goal, but also what's just noise, right? And then once they create space, they've actually got that space for a proper OD, experience in learning, and the time and the space to observe and digest and make the moves.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you. I mean, this sounds to me like it could be a different conversation in and of itself, how people learn. It's come up in different guises. I mean, this conversation is about it, but earlier we spoke about trial and error, as a way of learning. I think mimicking people in positions of authority is another one. So maybe we come back together and we talk a little bit about how we learn in the modern world of work. Just in the interests of time, guys, I'd like to move into our final question and really just do this round robin. So the question is really to finish up with something pragmatic so that the audience, the listeners, can take it away. What's one small shift in thinking that could help leaders or anyone see change as ongoing rather than a once-off event? So, Doug, maybe we start with you.
Sure. In the interest of kind of the learning, I think I'll use the three kind of areas of for leaders anyways, that they probably need some kind of understanding the skill sets of how they should be operating this way, some kind of tool set, so easy tools that they can these things you can teach. And then the third is probably the mindset shift, which I think we've been kind of going around a little, and that's a lot more difficult to teach.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I do think it's an investment, and it's probably of senior leaders giving their reports, so there's permission to try some new things and to probably just think about being more comfortable in ambiguity and that whole idea of holding the today and tomorrow. But that's a longer term prospect. But I do think you can teach some of the skill set and tool set elements.
And you've already given a practical way of doing that. Trial and error, micro experimentation teaches people how to live with ambiguity, which is an essential meta skill to hold change in a different way. So thank you for that. Sarah.
I think what I would say is that the shift in mindset from organization as machine, which is production outcome, into organization as an ecosystem, or something more tangible like a garden where there's interconnectivity, interdependence, and its continuity.
Nice. So using a metaphor, it's a lovely metaphor, and it's a powerful metaphor to help reframe the context in which people are operating. Thanks, Sarah. Allison.
I'll offer two here. One of them is extremely pragmatic, and going off of the point around tools and approaches. There are a lot of tools out here, but in traditional change management, we're taught very linear tools. And so what we need to be looking for are tools that are flexible and adaptable, right? Rather than just rely on the linear tools that we have. And one of those tools is a body of work called Liberating Structures. And if you go to www.liberatingstructures.com, they have taken a great amount of time and care to actually step by step give you 20 plus microstructures that you can use based on whatever problem you're trying to solve. And it was designed and intended that way so that anybody could pick up these tools and use them to start kind of loosening the rigidity of interactions and structures in organizations. The second thing I would offer is that, I think, Sarah, you started with that kind of concept of starting with yourself. Like anytime we're navigating change, We are a part of the overall system that we're trying to change. So we are the smallest unit of that system. If we can start with ourselves, that can be an incredibly powerful learning environment. And for most people that I coach these days, the way I offer or invite them to introspect or think about what their own internal experience is to check in on their own currency of energy. Where do you gain energy? Where are you losing energy? Oh, when you're doing that activity, you're losing energy. That might be a nudge to investigate what that activity is and why it is or is not helpful. Right. So if you're losing energy, that's usually some sort of feedback that whatever's happening in the system is either stuck or not working.
Yes. Or if you're feeling resistant, which is an extension of losing energy, to make it even more pragmatic,
Yeah.
that would be a really good, how am I feeling? Just a simple question would get you
Yeah.
to that answer. And I'll just reiterate, because Allison, you sent me to Liberating Structures a while ago, and I would reiterate that it is a fabulous, very fabulous set of micro learnings that really do help shift mindset. Thank you for that. And I really do want to thank all of you, Doug, Sarah, Allison, for spending the last 58 minutes with us. And I thought I would spend just a couple of moments summarizing a few points in our conversation. What I will do is summarize these key points and put them in the LinkedIn notes as well, so people got something they can take away with them. But I think in summary, what we've been saying is that change doesn't need to be chaotic or uncontrolled. We're not talking about that. You can absolutely bring structure and discipline to the process, but it can't be treated as a one-off project either. And the shift is in how we hold change, in a posture as leaders, our meta skills, our mindsets, and how we hold it with awareness, with stewardship, and with a sense of responsiveness. And what we touched on is the ability to hold paradox, maybe not resolve the paradox, but at least hold it. Things like the spectrum of control versus responsiveness or evolution, doing more or doing less or enough, transforming the business and running it at the same time, structure, emergence, short-term, long-term. I think the other thing, and I just took some notes as you were talking, and thank you for everyone's practical solutions. What we were saying is that small strategic shifts can create big change. Micro learning can even create big change. And we spoke about things like stepping back and observing patterns. It seems like a simple move, going to have a big ripple effect. Defining enough for your system rather than constantly adding more. Pausing, sensing, and guiding, not pushing or suffocating the system. And using micro experiments to learn and adapt. So we'll summarize all of this. We'll share a short recap of these insights. I want to perhaps just end off by saying that if today's conversation sparked an idea or a question or urge to want to share, please feel free to connect with any of us afterwards. We'll have everyone's LinkedIn profiles attached to this post, or share your reflections in the comments section, because I know all of us would love to hear how change plays out in your organizations. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and attention. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, Gaby. And thanks, Allison and Sarah.